The Robben Island Museum Council will on Wednesday launch its 2023 declaration as the year of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. The day seeks to commemorate the 3rd of May in honor of Dr. Sobukwe, who was banished to Robben Island as a political prisoner 60 years ago. The memorial prison site is also celebrating its nomination for a World Travel Award in the category of leading tourist attraction. We're now joined by the chairperson of the Robben Island Museum Council, Prof Saths Cooper. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this morning. Why Dr. Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe? Prof, are you there with us?
Yes, I am.
Why the choice of Dr. Sobukwe for this year?
Well, it's a significant year because he was the first person to be ever banished to Robben Island during the apartheid era without any trial and detained by police, kept in a tin shack and then moved to the house that we will unveil on Wednesday and open to the public. He was the only person affected by a legislation termed the Sobukwe Clause, because every year from May the 3rd, 1963 onwards until 1969, it was renewed. So for 6 long years, here was this man who led the peaceful anti-pass campaign in Orlando, and his followers in the PAC and community members did the same in Sharpeville, in Langa, in other places. And he was regarded as such a threat that they kept him out of sight, out of mind. And indeed, there are very few records of him anywhere to be found, whether it is in the National Archives, whether it is in the previous state and now public broadcaster, the SABC. You cannot get any recordings, anything about him, and he almost seems to have been written off history. So that aspect ties in quite sensitively to the colonial banishments from Dutch settlerdom through to English conquest in different parts of the country, where different leaders, including Balele, including Makoma, Makanda, all these key leaders were banished to Robben Island. So Robben Island is filled with pre-colonial and colonial as well as current history. And so we felt that on the 29th year of democracy, it's appropriate to recognize this sterling leader. He definitely falls in the pantheon of national and continental and global leaders. Somebody who actually said there are no races. There's one race, the human race, and stood for that very avidly.
I'd like for us to expand on this, a man that you say was a threat to the apartheid government. How would you characterize his ideology or his politics?
I think it got a bad rap. It was very clear that, in a sense, when you said non-racial, people tolerated it up to a point. But when you said Africanist, that was a threat to media, intellectual, political narratives at the time. And ironically, his biographer was a deputy editor of the Rand Daily Mail, Benjamin Pogren, who treats him in a very human way. There are challenges to that history, of course. And interestingly, Bishop Peter Story of the Methodist Church actually visited and spent time with the Prof, as he was called, and was one of the few priests who ministered to him. Sobukwe was a Methodist. I think Mandela was also a Methodist. And it's also significant that this year is the 60th anniversary of the Rivonia trial and the Rivonia trialists landing on Robben Island. So you have this layered history, you have the attempt to wipe out certain parts of our history. Remember that if it weren't for the PASS campaign, anti-PASS campaign, the ANC and PAC would not have been banned, and our history may have been very different. Just as after the banning of the Black Consciousness organizations, the murder of Steve Biko in police detention, the narrative of blackness, of Africanness, Africanity, is something that on the southern tip of Africa is very hard for those who are colonial and of racist mindsets to accept. And that is part of the problem, Duduzile.
I'd like to pick up on something that you said. You said there are challenges to the history of Robert Sobukwe and his friend Benjamin Progrund. What are some of those challenges?
Well, I think that some persons feel it shouldn't have been a white person to write this. Just as with other important heroes. I think the opening is there for our writers, black writers if you like, to fill that gap and create of his history in their own idiom, because I don't think Progrund attempts to represent Pan-Africanism at all. He's talking about his relationships and his encounters, which, by the way, pale into insignificance in terms of Peter Story's many ministrations and discussions. And I think that that would be an interesting counterpoint to the man, the humanist, and Peter Story is alive, and we are going to invite him, I'm sorry to mention it here, but to invite him to reflect on those, because they seem to have been very poignant and important, an important part of our history which we have to capture.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. What risk do we run as a country with the erasure of very critical parts of the puzzle of our history? Who gets to decide who makes it onto history's Hall of Fame, and who gets to decide who doesn't?
Well, let's be very clear. Our democracy is, it's in our statutes that everyone who played a role ought to be recognized. Indeed, in Robben Island, we have a repository and we continue to record the stories of the warders. However, those actually also pale into insignificance when you talk of the torture, the terrible life that some 3,000 prisoners during apartheid underwent on Robben Island, and unfortunately there's less than 500 left. So all of that is important to record. So our democracy records that. Freedom Park is supposed to have a wall of recognition for all who played a role from pre-colonial to the current times. Robben Island is fairly specific in that it records colonial history, it records the resistance of the Koringwa Auchimato, called Harry the Hottentot by the Dutch, and Krotoa, a 9-year-old girl who was taken into Van Riebeck's household. So all those issues are important, and if we don't record it, and we just look at it as the symptoms, like your previous issue of the mayoralty in some place, we will be a lost people. We will never anchor ourselves in where we come from, and we will be fighting each other on languages, on factions, on narrow politics, and forget the majority of our people, the historicity of why and how we got here as we go into our 30th anniversary of democracy. That history is vital to capture, because our people do have a history. They're not faceless. They're not invisible, and thousands of people played their role, and they ought to be acknowledged by us. We cannot continue to be an ungrateful nation as we seem to have been.
Just imagine that Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe is not, there's an erasure about his life and the great feats he managed to achieve under such very strenuous circumstances. So what does that then say about even the young ones who are coming up in South Africa of all races? Is this not a missed opportunity to catch them while they're young, if you will, right? Especially when we speak about history in South Africa, which oftentimes informs the future as well, because the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Absolutely. And that past behavior on Robben Island, where, as I said, up to about 3,000 prisoners were incarcerated, the majority came out, played their roles without bitterness, and tried to reconcile with those erstwhile oppressors. So there's a great lesson to be learnt there. There are other lessons on the survival of people under extreme conditions. What we confront now, if we take the lessons of ordinary Robben Island prisoners, their sterling conduct, their principled behavior in the face of extreme adversity, some horrific things happened to nearly all of us on that island. Those stories are so important to capture so that young people can get a sense of where we come from and where we ought to go. History, unfortunately, has not been taught appropriately in our country. So we have history, but it's an alternate subject. There's been talk about making it compulsory, but that history has to be written by those who played the role, not interpreters who actually will bastardize that history, will misrepresent it and continue to alienate ordinary people, and particularly young. And remember that 60% of our population are under 30, and most of them have little sense of that history. But the moment you speak to young people at all strata of society and mention some of these stories, mention these different epochs, up to the banning of the ANC and PAC, the rise of black consciousness, the 1976 apotheosis of our struggle, and into democracy. People get enthused. Indeed, student struggles in a democracy have idolized but missed the boat in terms of actually consolidating that history. And I think that we need to, and Robben Island, Freedom Park, various historic memorializations in this country are intent on recording, capturing those stories, and reflecting it unedited so that you don't have a writing off of critical players. And I don't feel impugned because of my classification or some other narrow precept that is artificial. We need to reclaim our common humanity. We are one race, the human race. Our biology is the same, but external appearances are used to keep us apart. And it's about time, as we move into our 30th anniversary of democracy, that we rethink and reset what this nation that was inspiring to the entire world ought to be in its lowest moments as we confront them now.
Prof, very quickly for us, how do we also make spaces such as Robben Island accessible for a Tulane who lives in Zola?
Everyone can apply to visit the island. We are, our announcement on Wednesday will include that all children under 15 will be allowed free onto the island. Of course, there needs to be liability issues, so a responsible adult needs to sign off on that. That's the start. We are also working through various government agencies to locally memorialize the kinds of struggles that living heroes and heroines have been involved in where they live. So in Zola, in Langa, in KwaMashu, there are people who have been incarcerated, whether on Robben Island or elsewhere, and we are going to work with local municipalities, with basic education and higher education and science and technology departments to make those living stories, living legends accessible to our schools so that they can interact with our children and our children can actually understand our society clearer than the miasma that seems to engulf us with hopelessness, with corruption, with self-serving politicians and others who actually are not the agenda. Our people, our country, our future is the agenda.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this morning. Robben Island Museum Council Chair, Professor Saths Cooper.